India and Japan. Now, the first thing that you have to think about is there are three areas it's possible for the Japanese-Indian thing. One is to build on the knowledge, Japanese-Indian knowledge complementarity to build joint ventures. We heard about that a little bit earlier in the area, for instance, in fact I'll come to it and elaborate. The second thing is exploit Japanese expertise in infrastructure development to support the anticipated colossal Indian urban expansion. Between 2010 and 2030, the Indian urban areas will actually add 250 million new urbanites. That's like 2 Japans. In the next 18 years, they will add 2 Japans. And the infrastructure investment to manage that growth is going to be colossal. And in the area of transport and power, in which Japan has already invested in India, not very much yet, but that is an opportunity for them to do. So they are already involved, as I explained, in the Delhi-Mumbai project. And the final thing is the creative business opportunities in serving the Indian aspirants, people whose income level is just below the middle class right now, where the Koreans are able to be successful. But I will not talk too much about it because I know that Lata is going to talk about it in great detail. That's the focus of our talk. Now, this is complementarities and business opportunities. Whereas Japanese expertise in IT hardware and Indian strength in software, these are clearly opportunities for in Japanese-Indian collaboration, because given the nature of the fact that there is it's no longer possible to produce low-wage production facilities, that phase is past. They have to focus on these kinds of areas where you take advantage of knowledge complementarity. Then there is considerable complementary knowledge and expertise in area of pharmaceuticals, we heard about that, biotechnology, machinery, heavy engineering, foodstuff and manufacture of foodstuff. That could be a paradigmatic shift in the way FDI is used in collaborations between a highly technically advanced economy like Japan and a rapidly developing economy like India. This is an opportunity here clearly. Then this is the point I want to be: infrastructure supporting explosive economic and urban development. 250 million new urbanites and a quadrupling of real per capita income will quadruple in real terms by 2030. That is an enormous growth. Transportation, power, construction, and infrastructure investment is something, especially power and transportation, is something in which the Japanese have a lot of experience. They are actually involved in the Delhi-Mumbai corridor. This is the area, this is a 6-state area from Delhi, UP in the north, to Mumbai and Maharashtra, going through Gujarat in this area. So about a 1,500 kilometer corridor. There is actually government wants to spend quite a bit of investment in the area. And by the way, I forgot to mention that the Japanese Overseas Development Agency has been the biggest, India has been the biggest area in which it has expended almost 30% of its budget in India, and a lot of infrastructure. And I understand they have committed to $2 billion at least in infrastructure investment in the area. And this area is supposed to not only produce export-oriented development areas, heavy density freight corridors, and Japan is, government has committed itself. But there's a lot of opportunities, private companies of all kinds to work in this area too. So I think I have run out of data as well. Thank you.
The Japanese enclaves are coming there in BMIC corridor. That's a part of the project.
I know, it's part of the project, yeah.
The old people of Japan will go there and,
that is a service sector, as somebody pointed out, service sector. Opportunities for in the health service industry.
They have the medical checkup and tourism, and then come back after, say, spending 3-4 months there. They'll spend the winter they don't like in Japan, they will
But even more revolutionary was offered this morning. Somebody said they should have nursing homes there and stay there.
Yeah, Japanese eco-cities and all these things have come as part of the plan. Eco-cities and, yeah, questions, comments, please.
Yes.
Yeah, I'm Abigail Friedman with the Asian Foundation. A very interesting report you just gave. What struck me was your comment about that governance issues are hindering Japanese investment in India.
Yeah.
Could you be more specific on what the governance issues are? And wouldn't this then suggest that at some point JICA would want to go beyond simply funding infrastructure, but also fund efforts to address governance issues in India?
The governance issues I was referring to was specifically the reference to the explosive urban expansion. There are two kinds of problems. If India has to manage 200 million people within 20 years to move, migrate, second largest migration in American history after the Chinese urbanization is taking place, that is taking place now, it requires three things. One, huge investment of capital for infrastructure, and then the Indian local, national, governmental organization of institutions to deliver these and manage these services. Those governance structures are very much handicapped in two ways. One, India never developed them. Second, between 1950 to almost 1990, India has been handicapped by its sharing with prejudices, anti-urban prejudice, which inherited from the British.
It's
Anti-urban prejudices. The whole garden city movement, in which the upper middle class of Britain looked down upon urban growth. And for 50 years we've been saying, don't develop big cities there. The fastest way to grow in a country is for cities to grow. Now, we are just overcoming this, and our institutional heritage reflects the fact of our anti-urban bias. So that what I mean by institutional bias improvements. And the Japanese talk about it, but there is a beginnings of a change that is taking place. But because along this, as Gautam and I pointed out, it's corridor, the government is making it a lot easier and allowing institutional flexibility. So that is a possibility there. Yes, please.
Can I ask you? So yeah, it's a sort of following question.
Yeah.
A previous question mentioned to the governance. So I'd like to ask, in my view, the biggest risk of India now is corruption.
Is what?
Corruption. How to
Corruption,
control, how to
sure,
manage
yeah.
corruption, and in particular this week you had a big election
Yes, yes.
local level, but unfortunately you had a very bitter lesson of that election. So that in terms of the corruption and better governance,
Yeah.
I think I'd like to ask your idea, how to do it, how to improve.
Yeah, as they say, we always have corruption with us. I'm not justifying corruption, but the point is, within India, there are some states, like the one I come from, Tamil Nadu, or Gujarat and Maharashtra, where the leaders are corrupt, but they also deliver services. They also provide ports, provide things to stimulate. There are other states like UP, the one you heard the election recently, where they take the money and don't do anything. So this is a process which can only be healed by time. I mean, all countries have corruption. I'm not justifying India, but they take different forms. In the US, we have various kinds of lobbies. It's institutionalized here. Corruption is institutionalized in a variety of ways. There it's very open and grabby. So that corruption is a serious problem, and that is reflected in the rate of growth. In fact, you can almost see the rate of growth of a state, economic growth in a state, depending on the level of obvious corruption. And if there's a payment after corruption, those states are doing well. And takes only time, over time. I have no answer for it. Yes, sir.
In your presentation, that you suggested that one of the collaboration models between Japan and India is that Japan could manufacture the hard machinery or hard things, and India may take care of the IT software development.
Yeah,
But when I look at the presentation by Dr. Das,
yeah,
his diagram of trilateral interdependence, he suggested Japan could be more R&D or product design, and India would be more manufacturer based on the design R&D from Japan. I just wonder how
So actually,
these two things.
excuse me.
to stop, actually Dr. Das also said that it can be anything. It was just an example. It can be other way around also.
Okay.
He mentioned
That's
very
the
clearly.
moving target.
It was just an example. There's one example. It could be other way.
But it depends on the industry. In some industries, what you say is a potential. What Mr. Das pointed out is their R&D Japan could do in production. But what has been recently noticed is the fact there's a lot of what is called, I forget the name. It's not a clever innovation or for instance, we have machines, various kinds of medical devices that were in the hospitals in America. Each of those devices used to cost $900, $1,000. But in India, they were redesigned and could be sold for $80 because Indian hospitals could not afford it. This frugal innovation, it's called frugal innovation, has been taken by GE and the German company back to Europe, and now American hospitals get them for $150. So the innovation R&D goes the other way too, because those are some possibilities. I'm just giving one example. Several other possibilities like that exist, and that benefits to Japan, Europe. A lot of European, German companies are coming and working in Chennai and in Bangalore for these kinds of frugal innovations. It's possibility.
Okay, thank you, sir. So, Bill will be the next speaker. Bill Anderson.
Okay, thank you. When my old friend Gautam Ray asked me to participate in this conference, I didn't know really what I would have to contribute to it, since my research mostly has to do with the economic relationship between Canada and the United States. But we thought maybe there would be some lessons from the experience of Canada's integration with the United States for India and Japan. When I say lessons, I don't mean that in sort of a normative sense that India and Japan should learn from Canada so much as the idea that both the successes and the failures of this relationship would have some interesting lessons for India and Japan. Canada-US trade is and has been for a very long time the largest bilateral trade relationship in the world. So Canada is, even when you ask most Americans on the street what's the #1 trading partner of the United States, very few of them know that it's Canada. In fact, until fairly recently, it was the largest relationship with the United States by a long haul. However, it won't be for long. In fact, Canada has already fallen to second place as an exporter to the United States to China. Canada is still the largest importer from the United States, but at least that's something Canada and Japan have in common, is the experience of being eclipsed by the Chinese. If we look at the history of the relationship between Canada and the United States, it starts off from a relationship very much based in a strong protectionist policy by Canada. Canada became an independent state in the late 19th century, 1867 actually. And they put in a protectionist policy in order to do two things. One is to try to develop industrial, manufacturing industries within Canada, which at that time was largely agrarian. And the second was to try to promote East-West trade, because Canada is this country that's sort of, even though you see it on the map, it's a great big country. Really what it is it's sort of a string of beads that goes along the border between the United States and Canada of centers of population that before this time really didn't trade with each other very much at all. So it comes from starts from a position of protectionism, but then you have gradual reduction of tariffs under the GATT. And then you have something very important, which in 1965, the Canada-U.S. Automotive Products Trade Agreement, what we always call the Auto Pact. And everybody probably has heard of NAFTA. NAFTA was predated by something called the Canada-U.S. Free Trade Agreement, or CUSFTA. And the reason that we had to bring in Mexico was because that was such a bad acronym. So we had to create NAFTA to get rid of CUSFTA. But really, the most important, historically, the most important thing in this relationship was this Automotive Products Trade Agreement in 1965. And I'll talk a little bit about that in a minute. What's the trade between Canada and the United States? What does the United States export to Canada? Well, it's kind of the type of things you might expect. Cars, trucks, and parts, general machinery equipment. If you take those first four categories, they make up about 50% of the United States exports to Canada. And there are no other categories that are above about 3%. And of course, you might expect that this is the relationship between Canada and the United States. Canada we think of as a resource nation, and so you would have the United States exporting a lot of manufactured goods to Canada and getting a lot of resource goods back. In fact, that's not the case at all. In fact, it is a little bit recently, because now the number one, I say it's fuels, it actually means oil, gas, and refined products. The number one export from Canada to the United States are those fuels. But that's a fairly recent phenomenon, and it has for many, many years been the fact that the trade between the United States and Canada is very much intra-industry trade, almost the same categories of goods going back from Canada to the United States as coming from the United States to Canada, and especially cars, trucks, and parts. And I'm using 2007 numbers because before the recession to be a little bit more normal. But if you went back to the early 2000s, it would be about 25% in both directions just for the automotive industry. And all of the things that we hear about a lot in North America in terms of trade between Canada and the United States, like softwood lumber and potash and whatnot, none of them account for more than about 3% of the trade. So fish, newsprint, all those types of things that we think of as being Canada, maple syrup, stuff like that, really doesn't amount to much in terms of the trade. The trade is very much based in manufacturers, with the exception now of Canada being a major supplier of oil and gas to the United States. So here we've got the largest bilateral trade relationship in the world, and it doesn't fit the classic comparative advantage model at all. In fact, I think the trade relationship between the United States and Canada is part of the inspiration of the new trade theory that tries to look for other bases for explaining trade, given that it's the largest trade relationship in the world. It doesn't fit the comparative advantage at all. And what you have is a lot of intra-industry trade based on scale economies and differentiated goods. And so if you know about the theory, you know that this kind of fits the Paul Krugman type new trade theory. But it doesn't actually really fit, because the other thing is that a lot of the trade is in intermediate goods. And in fact, it's hard to break this down, but I can say with some confidence that I think most of the trade is in intermediate goods. Intermediate goods meaning things that come from one manufacturer and shipped to another manufacturer. And so that results in what I call the operation of cross-border supply chain. So international production rather than the exchange of finished goods. And just to kind of explain how that works, I like to give the example of the town I live in, which is Windsor, Ontario, which is Canada's automotive capital. The two largest employers there, one is a big assembly plant and the other one is an engine plant. The assembly plant belongs to Chrysler. Like most assembly plants, it attracts a lot of trucks. It attracts about 1,200 trucks a day. 750 of those trucks come from the United States every day to deliver components to that plant. The other plant is an engine plant. It belongs to Ford. It produces V8 engines. All of those engines go to assembly plants in the United States. And so there's a very, very high level of integration across the border. And it's often said that a lot of this is intra-firm trade, and it's true that about a third of it's intra-firm trade, but actually that proportion is declining somewhat. And I think there's a number of reasons for that. One of the reasons is the sort of the divestiture of the automotive, sort of the vertical disintegration process whereby the automotive firms have sold off the parts-producing companies. If we look at this integration in the automotive industry, it starts from the fact that you had the Detroit Three. We used to be able to say the Big Three. Unfortunately, somebody called Toyota came along and messed that up. So that now it's not the Big Three, it's the Detroit Three, which is Ford, General Motors, and Chrysler. They all built plants in Canada to serve the Canadian market. And of course, it's very inefficient because you have very short production runs in Canada. And so with the urging of the automotive industry, you had in 1965 this auto pact, which allowed tariff-free movement of cars and parts across the US-Canada border. And this would avoid replication, so you're not, especially in assembly plants, you're not producing the same thing in two different plants. But also especially achieve scale economies in Canada so that you would have, instead of Canadian plants trying to produce a full range of vehicles or even parts for the Canadian market, they would produce for the North American market. You would achieve greater scale economies and much more efficient. And so the result is integration through these cross-border supply chains. And this is the nature of the automobile industry in North America is that, of course, and the automobile industry is always very, very much dependent on high-quality logistics because the nature of the beast is that you have a lot of different parts being moved around from one plant to another. But in the case of North America, those movements have to take place across the US-Canada border. There is some functional specialization, however, within that. And this, you probably can't read any of that, but it's from 92 to 2010. And these are Canada's automotive exports to the United States. And the blue is finished cars, and the green is parts, and the red is trucks. And so you can see that it's mostly finished cars going from Canada to the United States. And incidentally, a lot of those are Toyotas and Hondas. Honda and Toyota both have very, very large assembly plants in Ontario, Canada. The red part is trucks, and the green part is the parts. And you can see that it's also, you can see it's declining even before the economic crisis in 2008. And then if you look at the movement in the other direction, it's mostly parts that are coming from the United States to Canada. And so there is some functional specialization even within this intra-industry trade. And the reason for this that's usually given is the fact that it is the assembly part is the most labor-intensive part of automotive production. And labor costs in Canada are a little bit cheaper for one reason, because historically you had an undervalued Canadian dollar. But the other is healthcare. Healthcare is much cheaper in Canada. We have Obamacare on steroids in Canada. As a result of that, the manufacturers don't have to pay this. It's very, very expensive to pay this very high quality of medical insurance that's part of the benefits for certainly all unionized employees in the United States. Now, the thing that has changed recently, I won't take too much time. How am I doing on my time? Have I got 5 minutes left? Or? 5 minutes, all right. The thing that has changed is oil and gas exports to the United States. They've become a much more important part of this trade relationship. There are large gas reserves, this is in the western part of Canada, the prairies and province of Alberta in particular. And then we have something called oil sands. It depends upon how you feel about this resource. If you like it, you call it the oil sands. If you hate it, you call it the tar sands. Okay? But this is petroleum that needs to be upgraded, and so there's a lot of energy that goes into the process of bringing this to the level of crude oil, and therefore it has this larger carbon footprint. And I won't go into that because I don't think it's that relevant to what we're here to talk about today, except to make the point that if you look at Canadian exports to the United States overall through time, you can see they kind of peak around almost $400 billion. The oil and gas makes an increasing share of that, and if it wasn't for the oil and gas, those exports would be declining. And so this very strong relationship between Canada and the United States shows decline in a number of areas. And I should make the point that these numbers are all for merchandise trade. There's also trade and service, which is maybe between 15 and 20% of the trade, and that part is probably much not in decline. What are some of the reasons for the stagnation and decline in Canada-U.S. oil exports? Well, one, of course, is the crisis in the automotive industry. So because the automotive industry plays a big role here, and just to give you an idea, the North American market is down from 18 million units per year in 2000 to 13 in 2011. That got down to like about 9 during the crisis. But even before the crisis, it had dropped. The number of cars sold in the United States fell by 8% between 2000 and 2007. So a lot of the relationship is based in an industry that is not growing. But another thing is the rising volatile Canada-U.S. dollar. Canada dollar, and I know about this personally very much because I moved back and forth several times between Canada and the United States. And it seems like every time I need to sell a house in Canada, the dollar's at about 67 cents. And every time I want to buy a house in Canada, the dollar is $1. And that's not an exaggeration. That's what happened to me in 1998 and 2008. But it's also very, very volatile. And so this has created a problem because of the fact that most manufacturing firms, especially large-scale manufacturing firms, not just in automotive, but certainly in automotive, most of what they produce will be sold in the United States. That's the nature of this trade relationship. And so if you're setting up a plant, for example, if someone like Toyota is to build a new plant, they know that they're very vulnerable to the exchange rate risk. Increasing global competition, this, to some extent, U.S.-Canada trade is being squeezed out by more international trade, and I'll show you something about that in a minute. And also what's called the thickening of the Canada-U.S. border. And the thickening of the border is this cliche that we use to mean it's actually more difficult and more expensive to move things back and forth between the United States and Canada since September 11th, 2001, because the border security has been heightened so much. And in fact, that issue is the main topic of my research. In fact, I have a research chair at the University of Windsor that is basically to look at this problem. So what are some of the lessons from this? Well, first of all, I think it's sort of interesting the fact that we have this largest bilateral trade relationship in the world that really doesn't fit the model of comparative advantage. It doesn't exactly fit the model of the new trade theory either. It's really about cross-border supply chains and intermediate goods. Another thing is, if you look at this historically, it's very clear that a single sectoral trade agreement was what led to the broader trade agreement. You wouldn't have NAFTA if you didn't have the Auto Pact of 1965, and that really sort of broke the ice and it sort of led the way to the broader trade agreement. This is a trade relationship that's largely driven by demand for intermediate goods, and that results in what we call cross-border supply chains. And I think the question for India and Japan is, can they be managed over a longer distance? Well, certainly Japanese firms have been considering this question for a long time, and the answer has really been that they would prefer not to. And to give you an example of this, there's a commercial website that looks at cars, and they have this Made in America index. What's the most American car, in the sense that it doesn't have a bunch of imported parts in it? And it turns out that the two most American cars are the Honda Accord and the Toyota Camry, because of the fact that Honda and Toyota and most Japanese firms do not like to source components over long distances, even very much between Canada and the United States. However, that's not the way some other firms feel, and especially General Motors, for example. General Motors has a new car called the Chevrolet Cruze, which is a big coup for General Motors, getting a better car in the what's called the C class, which is a sort of a standard compact class, where you have the Honda Civic and the Toyota Corolla. But that car, the components of that car are only about 45% North American. Most of those components are international components. And this is just a graph to show the trade in auto parts between China and the United States, and you can see this very rapid growth. Of course, it falls during the crisis, but explodes really between 2009 and 2010 from China. And that sale of parts from China to North America is almost as high as the sale from Canada to the United States, or from China to the United States. And so there certainly is the potential for running these sorts of what we call cross-border supply chains on a global scale. India, of course, has a great industry in auto parts, but its sales of auto parts to the United States is very small compared to China at this point. And Japan, interestingly, which sells $40 billion in finished vehicles even in 2010, which is a bad year, sells very little in the way of parts, largely for the reason that I just mentioned. A few more lessons. One is the high level of security is demanded by the U.S. and must be satisfied for successful supply chains. This security issue is very, very critical to doing business with the United States. And I think everybody probably realizes that. But it is something that you can see in the case of Canada. It is something that's had tremendous costs. And again, when you have a lot of supply chain or intermediate goods type of trade taking place, these costs tend to multiply themselves. Interfirm trade may be of decreasing importance, and so there seems to be institutional relationships besides interfirm trade that are important. The instability of the exchange rate is really a problem, and so not managing the exchange rate, it seems to, I think, most people in Canada now that the volatility of the Canadian dollar is one of the biggest economic problems in terms of relationship to the United States. And also the trade relationship can be very vulnerable to too much concentration in one industry. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
Questions, comments?
Yes. Thank you very much for the interesting presentation. But one point I cannot agree upon so easily is that this, when we consider about this the difference of wage level between two countries, India and Japan, still there is a good room for two countries to make trades based on the comparative advantage. You pointed out that no comparative advantage in theory.
I wasn't trying to make the case that comparative advantage isn't still important. I don't think one or the other of these perspectives on trade is correct. And certainly, if we looked at the automotive industry more broadly in the North American context, the other big thing that's happening is Mexico. And a lot of what we think of American cars are now assembled in Mexico. And that is a relationship that is very much based on comparative advantage. I guess my point is the comparative advantage isn't necessary. To have a very large trade relationship, you don't need to have differences in comparative advantage. The idea is that you have trade because the two countries have different opportunity costs, and yet the United States and Canada, that's not really the case.
You have a question.
So, what are the main point of your lessons for India and Japan? It's not clear yet. Can I ask you?
Oh, okay. I think probably the main point that I would make is that the very, very large potentials for trade in intermediate goods. Okay, so when we talk about trade between Asia and the United States, there tends to be a concentration on trade in finished goods. And you can see that the United States' largest trade partner for really the last 20 years, the trade has largely been in intermediate goods. The question, however, is whether you can provide the quality of logistical services that makes it possible to run these supply chains, because it's that much more difficult to trade in intermediate goods from a logistics perspective, in the sense that goods have to be delivered in relatively narrow time windows compared to finished goods. I mean, it's still, these days it's important with goods going to retail as well as goods in supply chains. But certainly that would be the main obstacle to be overcome, and yet we've seen with what's happening in terms of auto parts coming from China that it's possible to do that, because all of those auto parts naturally, I mean, some of them might be aftermarket parts, but the great majority of them are parts that are going into North American supply chains. So it seems to be possible to do that.
Any other question? If not, there's a chat to you.
One of the advantages of coming late in the day is that you can hang your coat on hooks that have been provided earlier. For instance, Gautam has given the legitimacy capital issue with the BOP. Dr. Kobayashi has given the long tail. You will see that the BOP is very much looks like the long tail, though I will later discuss, not now, but the basic differences. There are some similarities and differences. And of course, Michael has talked about cultural learning and the fact that in order to make new models of capitalism that might work, especially for the poor, we need cultural give and take and evolving of new forms of capitalism. But my talk today is not on theoretical issues, not because theory is not important, but because the last 10 years in which the BOP has come up, has gone viral. Basically, it's an enormous area of research. What has happened is it's mainly theory. There's lots of examples of practical applications of this, but there's very little systematic analysis. of failures and successes. So I'm more focused on the practical part as to how the learning that we have done through actual experiences can inform us further about what can be done in terms of cooperation between these three major democracies, whose each form of capitalism is quite different. Now, I have to apologize for the quality of my diagram. It's not my, by the time it's in your handout, by the time I got it done, I had to send it to Japan. And today my computer crashed. So I wasn't even able to import it. So I had to go back 50 years ago to my Indian background as a student, to use pencil and paper, and this is what you got. Okay? Now, the role of the business sector, multinational firms I'm not going to talk about because we already talked about Suzuki and automobile parts and so on and so forth. In fact, Japanese FDI, which is one of the major ones in India, has been towards this multinational firms. The reason I won't talk about it is very little to do with the BOP. I've defined the BOP, and so I will focus on small and medium enterprises for two reasons. One is there's a lot of knowledge capital that is sitting in the SMEs that can be useful for Indian R&D and development. And secondly, it's a weak sector. It's a declining sector in Japan, and it pains me that so much institutional knowledge, so much success over years and years and years will go down the drain when there's possibility of joint ventures which can benefit both. Now, I think I'm going to skip through these because I'll go in terms of detail on them. So let me go to the chart, the beautiful chart that I gave you, which is the economic pyramid. And basically, I've got two which I've taken from other people and two which I've done on my own. So I would advise you to look at this, not blank sheet, but what's there. Now, the first chart is something which was done by the World Resources Institute in 2000, and which looked at the global distribution of income. And they said that 4 billion people, which is a tier 5, are the poverty. And what can governments and NGOs and foundations do to improve the lot of the BOP, bottom of the pyramid? Prahlad, which has already been mentioned by Michael, wrote a book in 2002 and then 2004 on how do you eradicate poverty by using business. And it caught like wildfire. It caught like wildfire basically in the United States. So there's a lot of knowledge here about experiments with dealing with business sector in this. I have to say almost nothing from Japan that I've come across with reference to India. Now the second one is a point I want to make is that there's a base of pyramid in every country. The question is the size, and that depends upon the sharpening or narrowing of the triangle. And as we move from the global pattern to the emerging markets, to the mature markets, the shape of the triangle changes and the size of that population that falls into the BOP, bottom of the pyramid, changes. The World Bank came out with a study I just read 2 days ago in the New York Times, which says that they have far exceeded the Millennium Goals already, ahead of time, because of China has taken 700 million people or 600 million people, whatever the number is, out of poverty. India's taken a lot of them out of poverty, and that is because of a concerted effort, partnership between the government, and I think co-production was introduced by somebody here. That means it's a partnership. I don't know, we call it alliance, we call it partnership, it doesn't really matter. What it means is that you need the abilities of all the sectors work together to help the poor. Now, if you go to the side of India, I want to make a point is which of the sectors in which you can have innovative participation. And these are the basic needs sector. However, I want to emphasize that this basic needs is not the concept of the 70s, because that was low tech, low cost, low efficiency solutions to the poor. In fact, what the modern model is that it should be low cost, high tech, high efficiency, value producing, and low cost at point of price. That's the model. It's a very different model that we are talking about. And therefore, countries that have a history of technical innovation capacity, such as Japan or the United States, have a comparative advantage. And of course, all three countries are entrepreneurial. India and US probably more so than Japan. There's a certain amount of rigidity there, which I think needs to be helped along, pushed along. But the technology has been very ingenious, and when one looks at the history of the SME helping the Japanese industrial agricultural expansion is a remarkable one. And these are the sectors which one can look at. I'll give you an example of the health sector, for instance, which came up a little earlier. One of the problems that Indian poor were facing is that they couldn't get access to x-rays because they were in remote villages, 80,000 villages or so, something like this. So there was a need for low-cost portable technologies, and it was developed in India to meet the local market. But what happened is now there is a service delivery system by which people carry these machines on their back. They go to the villages, they digitize the picture, high-tech, they push it to the low-tier cities, which are 1 million in India, and where the radiologists look at it, they contact the tertiary care centers in Bangalore or in Chennai, where the doctor advises them what to do, and you see the spatial link where each one is specializing in what they can do and serving the needs of the poor. Now, this kind of technology came out of Indian entrepreneurial ability and is now in doctors' offices in the US, where you go there and you no longer have to go to a big hospital or whatever to get your primary care. So these kinds of energy, I'll talk a little bit about energy as the last one, where the concept of virgin territory is an area which is not being dealt with in terms of solar. India government is pushing for an alternative clean energy and the micro power plants, and you must have an income of 50k rupees a year to be able to even access it. Clearly, it doesn't have the bottom of the population or the VOP. So I've defined what BOP is. I want to emphasize that the concept is poor are not victims, poor are not lazy, poor are the best entrepreneurs you can, because they manage with very scarce resources to live their lives, and therefore you need to release this and feed it so that it can get into technology. What sectors are appropriate I've looked at. An energy example that I was thinking is that Bloomberg estimates that there's $2 billion market for clean energy products like solar lanterns and household heating systems in India. And the Ministry of Finance in India has estimated that there would be 2% increase in India's GDP, 2%, if only people had a reliable source of energy. 500,000, including big cities like Calcutta and Chennai, have power outs and blackouts and whatever. So clearly there's a market for clean energy systems, and I can see one of the areas where there's success is solar cookers in India. But there can be partnership between Japan and India in this whole area. So what I'm saying is that we need R&D. It's not off-the-shelf technology that can be taken from Japanese SMEs and transferred to India. What's happening in between the collaboration between India and the US, where most of the activity is, or between Europe, because there are a lot of Indian expats and common language. So there are some constraints for Japan, but which we can do. Now, what are the attributes of this industrial expansion? Just now I saw about a week ago, India has almost eradicated polio. Amazing. And how did they do it? They did it with women going to village, slum to slum, and looking at a child and seeing if they've got a mark on their hand. And it's an indelible mark. If you've had a polio, oral polio, you put the mark, they go and, illiterate women go and see who hasn't had polio and who hasn't had the polio medicine. So what are the attributes? You need a distributed system of people with low-tech but highly specialized niche knowledge where they can do it. You need a system of production and quality control at a very high level. You need to produce polio medicines, not adulterated stuff. So there are certain attributes, and I'm not going into those attributes, but in the paper I will identify them, that you need these attributes for. Now, where is in SMEs in India, there is They're helping SOPs, but most of them are scaling up from NGOs to enterprise development, seeding them enterprise. That's the Indian version of helping the BOP. The American version, which is more model that Japan, India can work on, is actually developing new technologies or funding through social venture funds. Discovery and Gates, of course, is a very important name that keeps jabbing. But also, you can think in terms of, I'll give you an example of the what they call the Jaipur rugs. Again, that is they're exporting a huge amount entirely to the US. They're using wool from Australia, from China, blending it with Indian wool. The design is done in Milan and in Europe, and then they're producing it in 5 states with 40,000 weavers, and they're exporting it to the US. So what is that model of the new way? You need again, I emphasize, you need high-tech, centralized quality control, you need good design that will be able to sell itself, you need market research, you need branding, you need global supply chain. How is that any different from MNCs? Only the scale is different, the pattern is different. So we need to be aware of that when we are looking for R&D. Now, SMEs in Japan, historically, I don't need to talk to the audience here, they know how important it is. What is important that the share steady of the contemporary is still 60% of the SME share of exports, of their share in the economy since 1977. This has been by Jasmine, they're showing. However, they're surviving because of their support at the local and regional level. That means there's a spatial component. However, they are in trouble because most of their activities was in the auto sector, electrical sector, machine tool sector, where they were helping the large industries. When the industries are getting outsourced, as Bill just pointed out, the machine parts, automobile parts are not being exported. So they're hurting. They just came out a survey, I haven't had time to analyze it, where they looked at SMEs in Japan, looked at SMEs, and found 18 out of thousands that have been able to be profitable in spite of feeling this recession because they've changed their product. And one of them stuck in my head because it was good for India, is a coastal, it was an automobile unit that was making plastic presses. And when the automobile industry went in, they were in a coastal location, took fish and made biscuits, pressing the biscuits for children. And for children, because of the taste, older people are not going to take fish biscuits. But that's the way they are making protein at a low cost. And I thought, oh, what a smart idea. India's got so much coastal line, and you could get high protein food if there could be some partnership between the technology, high-tech technology that can be transferred. So I think these are these kinds of potentials that are there that needs to be, in my mind, I thought miniaturization, that is respect for space. That is something that Japan has always had, and that's something poor people in India have little space. So that is some technology that can come. They have respect for consumers. Professor Kobayashi talked about production of consumer commodities because you pay respect to what the consumer wants and the supplier responds to it. Responsive in design. I talked about Steve Jobs and how the design is aesthetic and it responds to consumers. Respect for the environment. I can keep on going on what Japan has in terms of its small and medium enterprises that can be transferred to India. I haven't done any research because there is very little actual experience of Japan doing it, but one can look to do that. Now, in terms of the US, of course, there's associations and foundations like Gates and Kellogg Foundation. There are social enterprise forums. It's a very vibrant area with social venture capital and so on. But the key concept underlying this is co-educate, co-create, concept formation. So that means together you do it because you can't transfer, you can't understand, it has to meet the needs of India. I'm talking about Indian BOP, has to meet the needs of India. But if you have microfinance developed in India, it comes back to the US as microfinance and microcredit organizations. If you have a development of various kinds of health equipment. It comes back to the US in terms of meeting the needs of distributed areas. So there is a give and take in terms of capital development. One example, which is the fastest growing sale of a production unit, is called Stitch. It's called Stitch Jeans. And it costs $6. And households are all, because it's a craze to wear jeans in India, so they're making these jeans and then they're selling it in the market. So it's employment, labor producing, consumer needs, and based on interrelationship. Also, the universities have been very big in terms of R&D, and which we talked about in Japan. We heard in the biotech firm, in the biotech area. These are areas that can lend itself. Now, let me conclude by some illustrations in terms of, how many minutes have I got?
Okay, finish it.
Finish it?
You're concluding.
Okay, let me go to my concluding comments. Now, it's a win-win strategy for everybody, for the BOP, for firms, because they become more entrepreneurial and more inventive. They can produce and provide services, and for governments. Why for governments? Japan spends so much money in India, but the visibility is very low. Visibility is low because they are highly capital-intensive activities. Cars. How many people buy cars in India? BOP certainly can't afford cars. But if you go into that sector where your SMEs can help the ordinary person, then the visibility for Japan will be commensurate with what their capabilities are and what the people need. So what are the potential areas of partnership with external firms? Manufacturing, ICT. Communications is huge in India. Information technologies can be... So finally, I want to say it's not easy. I'm talking about selling this idea. It's not easy, but we need to study the successes, we need to study the failures, and we need to learn from those successes and failures what is replicable and what is not. What kind of enabling role, for instance, JASME and the Japan for FDI has listed India as the top country for development of SMEs collaboration. So here we have an opportunity where there is a totally unexplored opportunity for doing this. So I see myself as looking at case studies and trying to make sense of it. Thank you.
Questions, comments? Yeah. President of USJI.
Just spend just 30 seconds. I used to work for UNDP, United Nations program, and I had a pleasure to meet with many Indian experts, Malaysia, Nigeria, Somalia, and the Caribbean. They are very much capable, very knowledgeable in their own areas. But I just wonder whether, what will happen if they go back to India to help, to start their own business, for instance, or to help others in India. Does it advance more, say, SMEs in India rather than big companies?
Yes.
That's one thing.
Yes.
The other one is,
answer is yes.
Yeah. The other one is the trilateral cooperation between United States, Japan, and India. I would like to suggest that maybe the Japanese ODA to some developing countries, recruiting Indian experts, which may also have the U.S. Financial input, so that we can have a kind of trilateral cooperation. That would be maybe a possible model. So I'd like to have your view on it.
I agree with you. I think we're in this room for that reason. That's what I think the project purpose of your funding this is. There's very little history to go on because in terms of cultural, there's all bilateral record. We have to work out the kind of problems that Professor Das said in terms of multilateral relationships, but it's definitely worth doing, and we should spend time as academics and as professionals talking about it around round tables. at a later stage bring in business people because they can put us feet on the ground and not our head in the air, and they can tell you what works and what doesn't work. And then eventually, we geographers talk about invention, which is R&D, making. I mean, when I was growing up, the Japanese Rice Institute made the Green Revolution possible in India. At that time, they were making, Japan, this is some 50 years ago, was doing hand, manual, modernized, scientific agricultural machinery. But what did India do? It went to tractors, energy intensive, agribusiness favoring, instead of using the Japanese model. I don't know if that is used in Japan anymore, those kinds of things. But I can see that it's certainly better for a farmer to use that than to have bullock carts pulling and plowing the ground. So it's possible to combine science, but I haven't, it's new for me, he just gave it to me. And so I haven't done the research to find out where there is a best match. But I'm pretty sure if one studies it, one can find areas where there's a good match between need in India and the capability of Japan to do R&D. Not off-the-shelf technology, but to do R&D that can meet the needs. And we can learn from the American experience because they're doing, huge multinationals are helping the BOP. Procter & Gamble, Pepsi Cola, they're working because why? This is the fastest growing, World Bank has said that this portion of the population is the fastest growing consumers that are, because top end is being saturated. So Lakshmanan talked about them as aspirers. So there's a huge potential for doing that, and I personally believe it's not been scratched. But again, having said that, I think we also need to look at the pitfalls and the dangers, things like Dr. Das said, that we shouldn't go in naively, but at this point, I'm selling an idea, so I'm pushing the idea. But I think you're absolutely right. There is tremendous scope, and should be. It's as Michael said, there's a moral component to it, apart from the business and profit-making component.
You have a question?
Yeah. And so thank you for your presentations. But I would like to point out that I think the Japanese small companies want a more marketing service or the distribution service from the Indian partners, because India is a very huge country, and also the greater Indian world is a very, very huge country, including a part of Singapore. So, but I think many Japanese small companies do not have a know-how of the marketing and of the distribution in the greater Indian world. So, do you think that some Indian small company can provide such a?
I think it depends upon what you're trying to market.
Yeah.
I think that the Japanese buying of firms, this is my opinion, I have not done a scientific study, of buying Indian pharmaceutical firms is basically to get hold of that distribution system. It's very difficult for Japan to do distribution on its own because of language barriers and what have you. But we also have to know that there is the product that the BOP consumers want. I mean, for instance, I think of clean energy is an area, I don't know how much you're doing scientific small-scale energy issues. I don't know. I'm ignorant about it. But those water cycle. Japan has the cleanest country that I can think, and India is one of the filthiest. Now, there's a lot of learning to go over there in terms of how do you respect the common property. Yet if you go to an Indian person's, and Gautam will bear me out, into a poor person's house, spotlessly clean inside, spotlessly clean. The vessels are shining and clean, but they spit outside. The common property is disrespected while you're personal. That's a cultural thing that has to be addressed. And I think more interaction between these cultures can address these issues. And of course, distribution is very important. But you need co-production, and co-production means co-partnership. So yes, you're right, you need SMEs, but we have to identify them too.
Yeah, now I'll invite, I think we while she comes and starts talking, I take this opportunity to tell you that I have a